Look up. Right now in this very moment, I want you to imagine the sky above your house isn't blue. It isn't gray with rain or orange with a sunset. It's silver. A dull, polished, terrifying silver that stretches from horizon to horizon. There are no birds singing. There are no planes taking off. Even the wind seems to have held its breath. Above you, millions of tons of metal are hanging in the air, defying every law of physics you've ever learned. And those aren't clouds, those are hulls. They arrived at 4:14 a.m. No radio signals, no grand proclamations, no demands for our leaders. Just a sudden crushing shadow that turned morning back into night. You've seen the movies. You've seen the fireballs and the monuments crumbling. But the reality is much quieter. It's the sound of a billion people collectively swallowing their fear. It's the sound of a father holding his daughter a little too tight in a dark living room. It's the absolute freezing realization that we are no longer the masters of our own home. The weapons were primed. We could feel it in the air, a static charge that made the hair on your arms stand up. The world was waiting for the first strike. We were waiting to become a memory. But then something happened, something so small, so seemingly insignificant that the history books will probably struggle to explain it. The fleet halted, the countdown stopped, and it wasn't because of a nuclear strike or a computer virus. It was because of a bowl of stew. Think about that for a second. The extinction of the human race was traded for a handful of ingredients and a seat at a wooden table. You have to understand, this wasn't a diplomatic summit. There were no cameras, no presidents. It was just a man named Elias. I want you to meet Elias. He isn't a soldier. He isn't a scientist. If you saw him in the grocery store, you wouldn't give him a second look. He's 68 years old, his hands are calloused from 40 years of carpentry, and he lives in a house that smells like cedar and old books. When the ships arrived, Elias didn't run to a bunker. He didn't join the riots in the city. He did the only thing he knew how to do when the world felt like it was falling apart. He went to his kitchen. Now imagine the scene. Outside, the shadows of the massive scout ships are carving paths through his cornfields. The vibrations are rattling the plates in his cupboards. The world is ending, and Elias is peeling potatoes. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But maybe it's the only sane thing left to do when the end is inevitable. But here is where the story shifts. Here is the moment where the "wait, what?" happens. Because as Elias was stirring a pot of beef and root vegetables, the last of his winter stores, there was a knock on his door. Not a metallic bang, not a blast, a knock. When he opened it, he didn't see a little green man or a terrifying monster. He saw something else. It was tall, wrapped in a suit that looked like liquid moonlight. It had too many joints, and its eyes weren't where ours are, but it stood there with a posture you'd recognize anywhere. It looked exhausted. It was the scout, the one sent ahead to designate the first target for the cleansing. This was the being that held the coordinates for our destruction in its hands. And Elias didn't scream. He didn't grab a gun. He looked at this creature, this harbinger of the apocalypse, and he saw the way its shoulders slumped. He felt the cold air rushing in through the open door. He looked at the creature and said, "You look like you've walked a long way. Are you hungry?" Now you're probably thinking, that's it? That's the big moment? But you have to realize the weight of this. For the scout, humanity was a data point. We were a biological infestation that needed to be cleared to make room for their expansion. They had watched our broadcasts. They saw our wars. They saw our greed. They had already decided we weren't worth the air we breathed. But they hadn't seen this. The scout entered the house. It had to hunch over to clear the doorframe. Can you picture it? This hyper-advanced being, capable of leveling a continent with a thought, sitting on a creaky wooden chair that Elias had built with his own hands. The room was dim, lit only by the low glow of the stove. The only sound was the bubbling of the pot. Elias didn't ask questions. He didn't ask why they were here or if his family was safe. He just took two bowls. He filled them to the brim. He set one down in front of the creature, and he sat down across from it. "It's not much," Elias whispered, "but it's the last of what I've got. Might as well share it." The scout didn't eat at first. It just stared at the bowl. It looked at the steam rising in the air. It looked at the chipped ceramic. And then it looked at Elias. In that silence, something happened that the hive mind back on the mothership couldn't calculate. For the first time in 10,000 years, a scout wasn't observing a target. It was experiencing a host. It reached out a trembling, multi-fingered hand and touched the spoon. Wait until you hear what happened next, because this is the part that changes everything. As the scout took its first bite, the entire fleet, millions of miles of ships, went dark. The weapons powered down. The cleansing signal was interrupted. Why? Because the scout's nervous system was linked to the flagship. Every sensation it felt, the fleet felt. Every emotion it processed, the commanders processed, and for the first time, they weren't feeling fear. They weren't feeling the heat of a weapon or the screams of a conquered race. They were feeling the warmth of a home. They were tasting salt and pepper and the slow-cooked richness of a meal prepared with care. They were feeling the quiet, steady heartbeat of a man who had nothing left to give and gave it anyway. You see, we always think the human spark is our technology or our art, but the scout realized something different. It realized that the most powerful thing a human can do is provide, even at the edge of the grave. But don't get comfortable yet, because while the fleet had halted, the commanders were confused. They didn't understand why the scout was sitting in a wooden shack instead of marking the target. Back on the flagship, a debate was starting, a debate that would decide if the next hour would be our last. They began to broadcast into the scout's mind. They demanded to know, what is this substance? What is this ritual? Why have you stopped? The scout looked up from the bowl. It looked at Elias, who was just quietly eating his own meal, staring out the window at the silver sky. Elias knew he was going to die. He assumed this was his last meal. And yet, he wasn't shaking. The scout sent a message back to the fleet. It's a message that we only discovered much, much later. It said, I have found a flaw in our logic. They are not an infestation. They are a species that feeds its enemies. We must understand why. The commanders didn't like that. They didn't like it at all. You have to understand the tension of that moment. One man, one alien, and a world held in the balance by a single spoon. If Elias had shown fear, we'd be gone. If Elias had tried to poison him, we'd be gone. If Elias had even asked for mercy, we'd be gone. But Elias just reached over, took the scout's empty bowl, and offered him the last of the pot. That was the moment the first ship began to descend, not to fire, but to land. And you won't believe who stepped out of it. The ship that landed wasn't a war machine. It didn't have the jagged edges or the glowing cannons of the ships hanging in the upper atmosphere. It was small, sleek, and it landed right in the middle of Elias's cornfield, flattening the stalks with a hiss of pressurized air. Imagine the sound of that door opening. It wasn't a mechanical grind. It was a sigh, a long, melodic exhale that sounded like a choir singing a single low note. Out stepped the fleet commander. Now, if the scout was a soldier, the commander was an architect. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its suit shimmering with the colors of a dying star. It didn't walk. It flowed across the dirt toward the farmhouse. Behind it, the world was still in chaos. People were screaming in the streets of London and New York, waiting for the sky to open up. But here, in this tiny patch of dirt, the most powerful being in the quadrant was walking toward a screen door with a hole in the mesh. The commander didn't burst in. It stopped at the threshold. It looked at the scout, who was still holding that ceramic bowl like it was a holy relic. Then it looked at Elias. Think about the gap between them. On one side, a being that had overseen the extinction of 1,000 worlds. On the other, a man who still used a rotary phone and forgot where he put his glasses. The commander didn't speak with a voice. It spoke through the air itself, a vibration that settled in the back of your skull. Why? It asked. Just one word. But that word carried the weight of every ship in the sky. Why are you doing this? Why are you sharing your resources when your species is minutes away from being recycled? Elias didn't stand up. He didn't bow. He just gestured to the empty chair by the stove. The pot's almost empty, Elias said, his voice steady. But there's enough for a guest. Sit down before it gets cold. I hate cold soup. You have to understand how offensive this was to them. To the fleet, life was a calculation. You take what you need. You destroy what is in your way. Efficiency was their god. Sharing your last meal with the being sent to kill you wasn't just kindness. To them, it was a glitch in the universe. It was a mathematical impossibility. The commander sat. The chair groaned under its weight, but it held. Elias scraped the bottom of the pot. He gave the commander the last of the broth, the last of the carrots, and the crusty end of a loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days ago. And then the conversation began. Not about physics, not about territory, but about value. The commander asked Elias, "Do you know what we are here to do?" "I've got a pretty good guess," Elias replied. "Then why feed the blade that cuts you?" Elias leaned back. He looked at his calloused hands. "My father told me something once. He said you can tell everything you need to know about a man by how he treats someone who can do absolutely nothing for him. Right now, you're the most powerful thing I've ever seen, and I'm just an old man. You can't do a lick for me. You're going to do what you're going to do." Elias took a slow sip of water. "But if I'm going out as a human being, and a human being doesn't let a traveler go hungry, even if that traveler is here to turn him into ash." Wait until you hear how the commander responded. It didn't offer a peace treaty. It didn't apologize. It took the bread. It held the bread between two long, slender fingers. It examined the texture, the rough crust, the airy center. It was looking at the result of thousands of years of human agriculture, fire taming, and labor. It took a bite. In that moment, the re-hook happened. The entire fleet, every pilot, every engineer, every warrior in the sky, experienced the sensation of leaven. They felt the crunch of the crust. They felt the simple, honest nourishment of grain. But more than that, they felt the intent. You see, their food was a slurry, a chemical compound designed for maximum caloric intake. They had forgotten, or maybe they never knew, that food could be an act of rebellion. They didn't know that a meal could be a way of saying, "I am still here, and I still care." The commander looked around the kitchen. It saw the photos on the wall. Elias's wife, who had passed 5 years prior, a dog that had lived to be 14, a drawing from a grandchild. It realized that this house wasn't just a structure, it was a museum of small, quiet loves. The commander turned back to Elias. "Your species is violent. We have seen your history. You kill each other over lines in the dirt. You poison the very water you drink. By every logic we possess, you are a failure." "Yeah," Elias nodded. "We're a mess. I won't argue with you there. We're selfish. We're loud, and we're scared most of the time." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the commander's alien gaze. "But we're the only things in the dark that make soup for strangers. You've traveled across the stars. Tell me, have you found anyone else who does that?" The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in the history of their empire, the logic of the harvest was failing. The commander was looking for a reason to spare us, and it found it in the most inconvenient place possible, a kitchen. But here is the twist you didn't see coming. The commander didn't just stand up and leave. It realized that if it spared Earth because of one man, the rest of the fleet would revolt. The hive mind required a consensus. It required a proof that this humanity was a universal constant, not just a fluke of one old man in the woods. The commander stood up. It looked at the scout. "The meal is finished," the commander said, "but the debt is not paid." The commander turned to Elias. "You have fed us. Now you must teach us how to feed." Elias blinked. "You want recipes?" "No," the commander replied. "We want to see if your soup exists in the cities. We want to see if the heart of the species matches the heart of the individual. If we find one more person like you, just one, in the middle of the chaos we have created, the fleet will depart." Elias stood up, grabbing his old coat. "Well then, I guess we better get moving. The world's a big place, and people get real mean when they're scared. But I reckon I know a few places where the stove is still on." Think about the stakes now. The fate of 8 billion people was no longer in the hands of generals. It was in the hands of an old man and an alien commander walking into a world that was currently tearing itself apart in terror. They headed toward the nearest city. And what they found there, well, it almost ended us right then and there.